where the Bible is silent, we try to be silent. And there is nothing more important than spending time daily in reading God's Word. I think this is great. This time we're going to read from God's Word, the text that I've chosen this morning. Turn with me and stand with me, if you will, to the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. And I want us to begin this morning by reading verses 1 through 17. And this being Mother's Day, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about a Proverbs 31 woman. And since we are looking at Ruth as our text, guess what? I think she is a Proverbs 31 woman. So let's begin reading. He says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab, and they lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. She was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. And with her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband.' Then she kissed them. They wept aloud and said to her, 'We will go back with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband, even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, and then gave birth to sons. Would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because of the Lord's hand has gone out against me.' At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. 'Look,' said Naomi, 'your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her.' But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me.'" You may be seated. Can you just picture in your mind, there had been a famine in the land and things were not going too well in Judah, and so Elimelech and his wife Naomi, they decide, well, you know what, we've heard that things might be better over in Moab, so they pick up and they take off to the land of the Moabites. And they get there, and their 2 sons, they find Moabite women, and they go ahead and marry them, and life goes on pretty well for about 10 years. And in the length of 10 years, at the end of that time, she loses her husband, she loses both of her sons, and that was a time of intense grief and mourning, wasn't it? I don't know if there's anybody here this morning who has gone through that kind of a situation, but that's what happened to Naomi. And so she's left with her 2 daughter-in-laws, and she says, you know what? Now we've heard that things are a little bit better back where we came from in Bethlehem, Judah, and we have heard that God has come to the rescue of His people, and so I'm going to go back home. Well, one of her daughters-in-law said, no, I want to go with you. And the other one said, I want to go with you. And finally, there was a time of discussion, and one of the daughters-in-law decided, well, okay then. And so she kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and stayed in the land of the Moabites. Ruth, however, said, where you stay, I'm going to stay. And I'm going to go with you. And there's nothing that's going to keep me from that. Now, that's my translation. And she accompanied her mother-in-law back to Bethlehem, Judah. And they get back there, and the townspeople, who I'm sure knew something about this, they saw Naomi coming with her daughter-in-law Ruth, and it says that the town was stirred because of what they saw. And my guess is they were stirred for a number of reasons, but probably one of those reasons was they saw the love and the commitment and the devotion of a foreigner to a Jew. And so they entered the town. Well, it wasn't long after that until Ruth went out and she began gleaning in the field. She said, I need to do something. So she went out and she began doing that. And she ended up in the field of Boaz. And she had favor with him. And he was a righteous man, and one thing led to another. And finally the day came when Boaz learned that Naomi was going to sell the land that had belonged to her husband. And so he said he found out that that was going to take place. And so then what happened? They had a town meeting, and the one who was to purchase the land was next of kin. And but he didn't want to purchase the land because he found out that if he purchased the land, that he also had to purchase in that day and time the dead man's widow. Well, he didn't want to do that because he would endanger his own estate. And so Boaz steps forward and he purchased the land. And so he also, in that transaction, acquired Ruth as his wife. It's a touching story when you read all that was going on there and the love and the devotion and everything that transpired there in the book of Ruth. It's a story about love and all that went through that. In Ruth, there are many people today who see likenesses of the wife who's also described in Proverbs chapter 31. Some, in fact, wonder if King Lemuel's mother, referred to in Proverbs 31, might not have been Bathsheba, who orally passed the family heritage of Ruth's spotless reputation along to David's son Solomon. Lemuel, which means devoted to God, could have been a family name for Solomon, who then could have penned Proverbs 31 thinking about Ruth and all the things that he had heard about her. So really, if you take that track, Proverbs 31 might be a chapter about Ruth identifying her character and who she was. Well, we don't know that for sure. We do know that a lot of the traits of both come together and could fit in the same person. Well, look at both women today. Both of them were devoted to their family. Think about this. In Ruth chapter 1, verses 15 through 18, Ruth tells her mother-in-law, I'm not leaving. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. There was intense devotion to family. Ruth had loyalty to her mother-in-law. Now, I want you to remember that it had been about 10 years that they had been acquainted. And my guess is, and when we look at this, Ruth, when she married when she married her husband, she understood that she was marrying into the family. Warts and problems and everything else, Her devotion was going to be there. Her commitment was going to be there. And that comes out later in chapter 1. In Proverbs, we find out in Proverbs chapter 31 and verses 10 through 11, it says, "A wife of noble character who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good and not harm all the days of her life." Proverbs 31 talks about a wife, a woman who has her husband's and her family's best interest at heart. Here was a woman totally devoted to the marriage. That's Proverbs 31. That's who Ruth was in the book of Ruth, and especially in Ruth chapter 1, they were both devoted to the family. Moms make a difference, do they not? Godly mothers, those who are righteous, those who want to please Jesus, make a difference in this world. I think about my own mother and what a difference she made in my life. She would cheer for us at the ball games, even when I was sitting on the bench in basketball. I don't know if you've observed this, but I'm not real tall. And back then, I thought I was pretty fast, but I wasn't real fast either. And so she would cheer even when we sat on the bench. Well, there were some other sports that I did a little better in, but I was no star by any stretch of the imagination. But she would help, and she would run errands. And when we did some small farming back where I grew up, she was the one who had to run the errands in the summertime into town and pick up a piece of this or a piece of that so we could repair our equipment. But that's what moms do. They love their family, and they're devoted to it. Both of these women delighted in their work. In Ruth chapter 2 and verse 2, Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." You know, when you harvested the crops back then, they would go and they would cut the sheaves, they would harvest the crops, but then anything that was left over and fell to the ground, they weren't to go over the second time and pick it up. They were to leave that for the orphans and the widows and also the foreigners in their land. That's who Ruth was. And she said, "I'm going to go to the fields, and I'm going to do this work." There was nothing that was beneath her. She was going to work and do what she could to be helpful in the family situation. She needed to contribute. Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31 and verse 13. I want you to notice that. It says, "She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands." You see, when it talks about somebody in Proverbs 31, this kind of a wife or a woman, it's somebody in whom nothing was beneath her. She would do what she could to be helpful. Proverbs 31 woman, I think that captures who Ruth is. In the whole book of Ruth, she did whatever she could, and that's what a godly woman does. Well, there's a third one, and both were diligent in their labor. I want you to notice something about Ruth in chapter 2. In Ruth chapter 2, notice verse 7. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." It says she went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. She wasn't just a worker, she was a hard worker, a committed worker, somebody that didn't have to have a coffee break every 10 minutes, but somebody who was out there doing what she could. That's verse 7. Notice also verse 17 of Ruth chapter 2. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, when the sun began to set. I would add that. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. Actually, during one day, she collected about 3/5 of a bushel in the way that we think about quantities today. But that was hard work. Verse 23 of chapter 2. Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. In other words, she started gleaning during barley harvest. She stayed on through wheat harvest, and she continued to work hard all of those days. They were diligent in their labor. Have you noticed Proverbs 31, beginning with verse 14? She's like the merchant ships, bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is still dark. She provides food for her family, portions for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. She got up early. She was a businesswoman too. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. Why? Because she's worked. She sees that her trading is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. She's planning and thinking about how she can work and be helpful to those that she loves. This Proverbs 31 woman was somebody special, somebody who was godly, someone who looked out for the needs and the cares of her own family. She, he says, when he gets to the end of the chapter in the book, is to be praised. They were both diligent in their labor. Well, there's another one. They were dedicated also to godly speech. They were dedicated to godly speech. I want you to look at Ruth chapter 2 and verses 10 and 13. At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. Now, that was customary back then. I've asked my wife a time or two to bow down and treat me that way. That's never happened yet. The day might be coming when that happens, but you know what? It's probably a little bit unlikely that's ever going to happen. But here, back in that culture and in that time and place, she bowed down with her face to the ground. That was a show of respect and honor. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you notice me, a foreigner?" She understood who she was in relationship to Jewish, or at that time, Hebrew people. And she was respectful of where she was. That demonstrates a very respectful speech on her part. Also in verse 13, it says, "May I continue to find favor." Notice how she says that, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. That also was the way they spoke back then to one another. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant." She also recognizes in her speech the efforts made by Boaz. Respect and honor. Something that I think is lacking so many times today in our culture. Respectful speech. Here was somebody who wasn't loud, and she wasn't rude, she wasn't crass about some of the stuff that she was saying in her exchanges with other folks, especially in this exchange, but she was respectful and had a quiet and a humble spirit about her. My guess is that even before her day, she had gotten a glimpse of James chapter 3. James chapter 3 that we've been through not too long ago on Sunday morning during the preaching time talks about the tongue. and how to tame the tongue. Now, I think that whole thing there is in a context of teaching, and be careful what we teach and all of that. But it also has something to do with our attitudes and the way we approach and our tact and all of that in speaking and in relating with folks in our culture, especially those who are closest to us. Well, the woman in Proverbs 31, the woman in Ruth chapter 2 were both dedicated to godly, reverent speech. Real quickly, both of them were dependent on God. In Ruth chapter 2 and verse 12, notice it says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." She'd come from Moab and came back to Bethlehem and that area. And it talks about the wings under which you have chosen to take refuge. And you see, she had wanted to come back and be a part of Naomi's people. She was dependent on God. She had made that choice. In Proverbs chapter 31 and verses 25 and 30, she is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh the days to come. In verse 30, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Something about that Proverbs 31 woman, she feared the Lord. And my guess is when Solomon writes this chapter, he has somebody very special in mind because of her lifestyle and her focus and the way she was in life. And he says she is to be praised. May very well have been Ruth. They were both dependent on God. She showed love and lived righteously. There was a trust in God. There's a couple more real quick. Both were discreet with men. You know, we live in a time, all you have to do is go to the mall. All you have to do is drive down the road. And you begin to observe what goes on in our culture. There is not a lot of discretion. From clothes that are worn, from speech, from attitudes, from everything else. But here's somebody who's to be praised. And one of her traits was she was discreet with men. You read that in Ruth chapter 3 and verses 6 through 13, but I also want to look at Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 11. Her husband, you see this, has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. Why? He knows she took her vows seriously. He knows that. He has observed her. He has gotten to know her, her character, and everything else. And he knows he can trust her. That was Ruth. When we follow the exchanges between Ruth and Boaz, and if you know something about culture of that time, and when you see what was going on and the interactions and some of that, she too was discreet with the opposite sex, with man. And of course the last one, they both delivered blessings. In Ruth chapter 4, I want to read verses 14 and 15. In Ruth chapter 4, verses 14 and 15, it says, "The women said to Naomi, 'Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel.'" By the way, did I say this? Ruth was in the lineage of Jesus Christ. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. Their son. Well, both delivered blessings. Ruth was used because of her righteousness, her devotion, her love. Because of all of that, her commitment to God, she became a blessing to others. Proverbs 31 talks about praising a woman like that. It also talks about integrity and righteousness. Proverbs 31:28. It wasn't long ago that I was made mindful of a cartoon. And this cartoon appeared. It showed a little 3-year-old boy. Came to the end of the day, and it was nighttime, of course, and that's just kind of what you read into all of this. And he was holding his teddy bear. And in the other hand, he had his blanket. And there he was in the hallway, standing outside of Mom and Dad's door. And the door was closed. And there is a sign on the door. And the sign on the door said, out of order. Closed for business. We have too many today, not just wives, but husbands as well, who are out of order and closed for business to those we need to be open for business to. There's one thing that'll get our society back into order, and that is following the pattern and the example laid out in Proverbs 31 and in the whole book of Ruth and everywhere else in the Bible. That is what it'll take to get us back into order. This morning, we appreciate our wives and mothers, but you know what? We appreciate especially those who follow the book that He's given us. We're going to sing a closing song of invitation this morning. If you have decisions to be made, would you make them as we sing, "Give Me Thy Heart"?